box in so much that the drop-down list box only allows us to it allows us to select from maybe 100, 200 different options, where the radio buttons, because of the amount of space that they take up, only allow us maybe to put 5, 6 within a group for selection. So understanding the propensities of each of the controls and then choosing the right controls for the situation can make all the difference when designing your forms. So in this case, we're going to change this to marketing radio button as the ID, and I'm going to change the text that appears next to the actual radio button by setting its text property. And we'll change this one to accounting, and we'll call this the accounting radio button. Okay, so now let's go ahead and test our application just to see how it works thus far. So I can select either marketing or accounting, right? Uh-oh, I have two selections here. What did I do wrong? Well, we can and we need to actually group these two together to let ASP.NET and the web browsers know that these are grouped together. So treat them as one or the other, but not both. And to do that, we will place them into a group. We'll call this group name department. So we have to make sure that both controls have their group name property set to department. Now let's try it this time that we've set that option. Let's see if it makes anything better. Okay, so now we can see a one or the other selection, but not both. Great. Now let's add a checkbox, and checkboxes are popular for whenever we need a yes/no type of question response from the user. So we're going to call this our approval checkbox. We're going to leave its check property to false, so by default it will not be checked. But we're going to change the text property to requires approval. And so let's test this now. So we can type anything in here, we can select something there, we can choose one of these, and then either click on or off requires approval. Great. Let's move on. We'll only use a couple more controls in this example, and then we'll probably use a lot more as we continue through this series of lessons. The next control I want to demonstrate is the use of the hyperlink, and we'll put this right next to this requires approval. And the hyperlink control is great whenever we want to dynamically change the link or the URL that a given hyperlink points to. So we can dynamically, programmatically change the hyperlink if we wish to by setting its properties within the code that we write for our application. So in this case, I'm going to type something like more information, maybe to provide a help area. And then I can set the navigate URL equal to some project folder if I wish to that's currently on my local hard drive, or I can type in a URL like Learn Visual Studio .net. I can also change the target from the current window to a new blank window. So we have options there as well. And now I'm going to skip over the rest of the controls within the standard area and talk about some of the I take that back. I am going to add a button control, and I'm just going to place this here. I'm going to call this the OK button. OK button. Great. And I'm going to add a label that I'm going to use a little bit later in this example, and I'm going to call this success label, and I'm going to remove the text property from here. Great. I'm also going to add one more label that we'll use a little bit later in this example called status label. So I'm going to remove the text property and call this status label. Okay. Now let's move on and talk about validation controls. No doubt you visited a website, maybe a website where you tried to pay for something online, and there were certain fields which were required fields. And so if you forgot to fill in a required field, the web browser would stop you before submitting that web page back to the web server and would say you forgot information in one of the following fields. You forgot to fill in the name, you didn't pick a status, you didn't choose a department, and so on. Okay, so ASP.NET 2.0 makes it very easy to add these types of field requirements as well as other types, not just required fields, but also check one field based on the values that are within another field or some preset values through the use of a series of validation controls. So you can see here that there's a whole validation section. What we're going to do is choose this required field validator, and I'm going to place one right next to our text box. And we're going to call this name required field. If I can, there we go. And I'm going to need to set some properties of this control. The first thing that I want to do is select the control to validate. This is going to give me a list of controls that this particular validation control can work with. And we're going to select the name text box. Next, I want to change the error message. I'm going to change this to just a star. So if there is an error, it'll put a little star next to it. Actually, for this first time, let's do something like this. Required field. And we'll change this a little bit later to use the star. Okay? So now let's run our application. And I'm going to click the OK button, but notice because I didn't enter anything into this that the required field message came up. Now I typed in some additional information, click OK again, and notice that it goes away. Nothing really happens because we haven't written any code behind our form. However, you can see the utility of the required field validation control, which requires that in this particular case something is filled out in the name text box before the form will be allowed to submit back to the web server. Very cool and very easy to do. Let's take this one step further. I'm actually going to move this status label down a little bit. And the next control that I want to use is a compare validator. Very similar to the required field, but instead of checking to make sure that the text property is not empty, in this case we'll make sure that it's not equal to some value. I want to make sure that the user makes a selection in the status drop-down so that select one and then an ellipsis is not submitted back to the web server. We'll stop the submission of that form before it makes it back to the web server if they have refused to select a status from this drop-down list box. So let's go ahead and set some properties of this control. First of all, we want to set the control to validate as the status drop-down. Here we have some options we're going to have to think through a little bit. First of all, we want the type to be set to string, and we want the value to compare select one ... and we need to change the operator so that it's not equal to select one. So now that we've set these properties, let's go ahead and run our application again. I'll type in some data there, and then I'm just going to leave select one. And notice that whenever I click the OK button, compare validator, I forgot to change the error message property, but you can see that it actually kicked into gear, and by selecting not started, it goes away. Okay? Here's another neat feature as well. Notice that both are now lit up. Both validator controls are lit up because both conditions are found to be in violation of the validation rules that I've set up. And so you don't have to nickel and dime your end user by saying you forgot the name, let them fill out the name, click OK, and then say, oh, well, now you forgot the status, and so forth. You can show them everything that's wrong all at one time. Okay, very cool. Let me go ahead and change some of the properties here. We will change the error message on both of these, and we will change the text to be name is required, and we'll change the text here to be status is, whoops, I think I got this backwards actually. Let's do this. Status is required. Okay, there we go. Name is required. And now we're going to use a third validation control. Great. And that validation control is called the validation summary. And so it will list everything in one big list at the bottom of our web page or at the top, wherever we prefer to put it, so that the user need to only look in one place to get a full explanation of everything that's wrong before trying to resubmit the web page. Now, I have not set any properties for this validation summary control, but by virtue of the fact that it exists on our web form, it's now ready to be used. So I'm going to run my application. I'm not going to fill in name or status, but I am going to click the OK button, and notice that it does put the red asterisks next to name and status, but at the very bottom it gives us the full explanation of the problem. Name is required, status is required, and I can make this as friendly as an error message as I want to. I can even add maybe an opening line that says, please fix the following problems before submitting the form. Very neat. Okay, so let's move on from there. Okay, so we're nearing the end, but I wanted to show you some neat functionality that's contained within the layout toolbar. So we already talked about the purpose for the layout toolbar in the previous video, I believe, or the beginning of this video, and that is to help us determine where we want to, or how we line up the items on our form. So you can see that the left-hand side of the name, status, and department labels are slightly out of a line. Looks like status might be pushed out just a little bit more than name and department. So what I can do is select all the controls, and notice that the name control has white carets around its selection. The others have black or grayed out carets around their selection, which means that whenever we use the layout toolbar, that it's going to use the current settings of the name, because it's the white carets, it's the last selected one, as the settings for, in this case, the left-hand side. So now we're going to click this align lefts, and if you saw, it was just a really small adjustment that status and department made. They were moved over to the right just a little bit. Okay. Now the same can be true whenever I select name and the text box. I may want to align their tops or align their middles. That's probably a better way to go about it. So it calculates what the middle XY position is of name, and then it sets that Y position for our text box as well. Now we can use other controls to decrease the horizontal spacing or increase horizontal spacing, or to remove any horizontal spacing, as I did accidentally. Okay, or I have the freedom to select it and use the arrow key on my keyboard to move things around to the right or to the left, up or down. Okay. Now in this particular case, maybe what I want to do is move these a little bit closer together, and I'll stagger these off. First thing I want to do is make the vertical spacing equal, so whatever the spacing is between name and status will be the same spacing between status and department. So here we'll select this button, make it equal, so it moves status up just a little bit. Then we'll want to select all three controls, and we're going to align their lefts, and then I'm going to select the controls here and align their middles. Do the same here. Whoops. And align their middles.